Good morning, everyone. So today's lesson is going to be on fundamentals of stagecraft and carpentry, measurements and tolerance. So the first slide is talking about basically what stagecraft is, and it pretty much is all of the technical aspects that are or are associated with any kind of theater production. They include sort of the building or rigging of scenery. We'll cover rigging later. Hanging and focusing of lights. We'll cover a little bit of that and go into a little bit of the design aspect as well later in the course. The design or construction slash procurement of costumes, depending on the program, that can be fairly in depth or pretty generic. Makeup, it's mainly associated with costumes, but it does helps in just about any aspect of a stage performance. The props or stage properties, stage management, who they are, what they do, which is everything, and the recording and mixing of sounds. Before we really dive into any of these sections, we sort of have to talk a little bit about the history. And this basically sort of brings us to sort of the overall layout of current theaters and also sort of shows us how a few things came to be. So it first started with the Greeks, and while I present below to be true, little is actually known except through sort of archaeological studies and educated guessing as to how a lot of this sort of was during this time period. This is a basic layout of the Greek theater. And then moving on into the next slide, we sort of get sort of an above view or top view of the layout of the theater. And the audience, or where the audience would sit, is known as the theatron. And it basically surrounds the orchestra on three sides, and it is entirely where the audience would be seated. During this time period, obviously, there wasn't really any kind of hierarchy as far as citizens went, so just about all of this would have been open to anyone. The orchestra itself was the main playing space. It was a large circular area where every play was performed. The skene or stage house was located at the very back end of the orchestra, and it basically was where everything would have been stored, such as the machinery that they used, any kind of props that would have been needed, changing rooms, and basically just provide a natural backdrop for the performances. One of the things that the Greeks did whenever they built their theaters was actually build everything in or on the sides of sort of mountainsides. One of the reasons they did this is they realized sort of the natural acoustics were fantastic when you have sort of this style and whenever you built on the hillside, any performer down below would be able to project their voice for everyone in the audience to be able to hear. While most of the plays were set outdoors, the Greeks were able to use a lot of various devices to sort of move scenery on and off. One such device was called an isiklemma, and this was often brought through a doorway located in the skene itself. It was a wheeled platform, and it was used in quite a variety of ways. For example, if a throne needed to appear, one throne could be basically put on an isiklemma and then have it sort of dragged out or pulled out on stage. One of the other sort of interesting usage for this particular device was during Greek plays, a lot of the sort of violence was always perpetrated or done off stage. You may have heard what was going on, but you never actually saw any of the violence. So typically, whenever you discovered that someone had died or was poisoned or killed, the end result would be the bodies placed on one of these isiklemas and then brought out through one of those sort of stage doors. Another piece or equipment that they used was known as a periactoi. And one of the easiest ways to sort of describe this is if you've ever seen one of those billboards that had the ability to sort of change the image through a periodic time displacement, that is basically what the periactoi was. It was basically a three-sided, really tall unit that could rotate on a central pivot. And each one of these sides could depict a different scene or a location and was most likely attached to the skine itself. Really one of the most intriguing machines that would have been used during this time period was known simply as a machina. In loose terms, this was basically just a giant crane or a basket, and it basically would allow an individual to be put in or on a platform or a harness and then lowered down to the orchestra level from a second level or from some offstage position. One of the reasons why the Greeks sort of used this is a lot of their plays sort of required some sort of divine intervention. And the machina would basically allow these sort of gods to descend or rise from the earth. Moving on to the Romans, a lot of what the Greeks had sort of created was sort of picked up by the Romans, though with a few modifications. One such notable difference was the condensing of the skine orchestra and the auditorium itself into one large structure. This basically resulted in a more semicircular auditorium, or in the Romans' case, this was called the cavea. And the orchestra was separated then by a short wall. Another structural change was the skine being transformed into sort of a more decorative facade known as the skene frons. And it was often built to the overall height of the cavea, or sort of the auditorium. While the Greeks sort of built into the hillsides, Romans always built a lot of their spaces from the ground up, and in most cases, from excavations and everything, it was discovered that they often used a roofing system. For the most part, this roof only sort of covered the playing space, but there are some instances where it is believed that they had a system that could cover pretty much the entire audience as well. One of the other innovations that came about during the Roman time was sort of the first use of a curtain in front of the proscenium. And they often sometimes had one at the back of the space as well. This curtain was sort of originally hung from a rope system and then dropped down into sort of a slot in the floor itself to sort of reveal anything that was behind the stage, or on stage, I should say. One of the other things little is actually known whether anything may have been painted on any of these. While we don't really have a whole lot in terms of what the Romans did with their theaters, it is safe to say that we do know a lot about sort of their other amphitheaters, such as the Colosseum or even the Circus Maximus. And with these two in particular, one of the things that we do know that Romans introduced or used a lot of was a lot of rope systems that allowed the use of sort of elevators to be used to bring things such as gladiators, animals, or anything else that needed to be brought up from below. One of the other interesting or fascinating things that they were also able to do with the Colosseum is the fact that they were able to flood the entire playing space to then be able to recreate some of those naval battles. Moving on then to the medieval period. During the Middle Ages, the church basically suppressed pretty much all secular dramas. Even though they were reluctant to have any sort of non-secular performances, they were actually responsible for sort of keeping theater alive in their own way. Clerics in the 10th century started to use sort of dramatized staging to sort of help portray lessons or doctrines to their congregants. Due to sort of the evolution of these staging events, they were eventually taken outside and became extremely complex during the 13th century. While it sort of varied from church to church and sort of region to region, a typical stage was built out of platforms and sort of was placed close or adjacent to the church to accommodate as much of an audience as possible. Some of these were mounted to rolling wagons, known simply as pageant wagons, and this allowed them to be able to sort of take their show on the road. For the most part, all of these sets were pretty much similar in concept, at least, and developed by the clergy. They basically composed of small buildings known as mansions or stations, and they showed basically appropriate locations sort of associated with biblical stories being staged. Often the stage would depict heaven and hell on opposite sides, while having sort of the middle ground be sort of the material world that everyone sort of existed upon. One of the important things that sort of came of these wagons was sort of the, again, evolution of machinery, creating sort of realistic effects. These were known as secrets, and these were basically trapdoors and various rigging that were used to basically either move people or objects across the stage or have something pop up. In one account, in Mons, in 1501, technicians were hired to build the secrets, and it took 17 hands to basically operate just the secrets for hell alone. Moving into the Renaissance era came sort of with the revival of a lot of secular dramas. Even though church pageants sort of continued, this is also sort of known as the Restoration period in Europe in general. Due to the sort of intrigue for that traditional classic form, almost all new theaters resembled sort of the Greek or Roman styles in their builds. One such theater is the one depicted here, known as the Teatro Olimpico, built in Italy between 1580 and 85 in the ancient Roman style. One of the significant changes, obviously, in this theater construction was the fact that they were finally moving towards an indoor environment. The cavea or auditorium also changed from a semicircle to more of an ellipse. One of the things that this did, even though it was fairly minor, was sort of improve overall sightlines of the audience. One other change that the Scène France took, or the stage house itself, went from basically a single backdrop to several archways that could allow the portraying of various locations. and were often depicted in forced perspective. This is also sort of where they started using what is known as sort of a raked stage. This sort of also sort of helps sell the fact that they had some sort of forced perspective as sort of a visual distortion. One of the other sort of second innovations during the Renaissance was the creation of a more elaborate scenery. And this was basically known as sort of the first use of stock sets. What was typically depicted on these multiple wings was sort of a combination of something that was either comic, tragic, or satiric. Moving then towards the other end of Europe, towards England, one of the most well-known Elizabethan theaters, the Globe, was an open-air venue which had a stage which was about 4 to 6 feet off the ground. It was basically, or it had one of the more well-known Elizabethan one of the well moving into sort of the other end of Europe towards England, one of the more well-known Elizabethan theaters, the Globe, was an open-air venue which had a stage which was about 4 to 6 feet off the ground. They often didn't have anyone or any performers in the orchestra level, and this pit was basically used for any kind of patron to enjoy a standing section. One of the things that they also sort of had or sort of utilized was the fact that plays were mainly built or created for sort of nobility. So nobility typically has some of the better seats. Since a lot of theaters had that forced perspective created for them, anything that was sort of in the middle tier and in the very center of the theater were basically the best seats in the house. And then as opposed to everything else, sort of the nosebleed section would have been sort of the cheapest and sort of some of the more poorest individuals in that era. Now, even though these images sort of show a fairly small venue, it is believed that the Globe would have been able to seat about 1,000 or so individuals, maybe more. Since it was an open-air venue, obviously it did not sort of go with the rest of the Renaissance or Restoration period. Now, though it was an open-air venue, it didn't sort of go with the rest of the Renaissance establishments sort of building their theaters, but it is definitely one that is remained throughout time, even though it has been renovated quite a bit. One of the other things that, at least in the Elizabethan theaters, was the fact that they wanted more comedies rather than tragedies. So one of the things that this particular theater did was it didn't utilize a lot of sort of elaborate sets. It mainly relied on the physical actors themselves, along with sort of the props and or other costumes. Moving in down towards the Restoration period. Again, there really wasn't too many major changes. They did elongate the audience a little bit more, so it was again more ellipse in build, and they sort of pushed upon or created more of an elaborate sort of forced perspective. But everything was still sort of used as a backdrop just for their performances. They did start to use sort of painted drops, wings, and or borders, again with the rig stage, even though they remain sort of generalized locations such as drawing rooms, gardens, courtyards, palaces, and so on. We don't really get too much change until we get sort of to the 20th century. The more modern styles of a theater that we sort of see today is kind of like the one we have at the school itself. And it's basically the proscenium style, where an archway sort of separates or creates sort of a TV-like portal to view any kind of a play. Usually having a fairly small apron in front of sort of that archway. A lot of the action sort of remains upstage of the archway itself. One of the things this caused was sort of, again, the sort of last revision to sort of the auditorium itself. Due to the fact that you had so much action happening upstage, this actually sort of killed almost all sight lines from sort of the extreme sides of a stage. So they pretty much just completely got rid of a lot of that side seating, and then just created something that was directly in line with the stage itself. One other form that took place is known as the thrust. And it basically is sort of the apron sort of being pushed out or thrust out towards the audience itself. Most notably known as sort of three-quarter thrust, and the three quarters basically just referring to the fact that the audience is seated three-quarters of the way around that particular stage. They still generally had an archway and then sort of a stage house still, but the majority of the action would take place on that sort of open landing, as you can see in the picture below. One of the things that this meant was the fact that they couldn't use a lot of sort of elaborate sets due to that fact that you have a lot of the action sort of taking place where you need so much visibility. So this is where a lot of the time any kind of props, again, were kind of mainly used, unless you had something that was fairly transparent. One of the other forms that we sort of create or came about is basically known as the arena style. Now, even though some of you may have never seen a performance in your life, if you've ever been to a sporting event or watched a sporting event, just about every single one of these events is in this sort of arena style. It basically just sort of says that the audience is completely surrounding sort of the playing space. It was created due to the fact that some production companies wanted to have sort of a more immersed feeling between the action of the actors and being so close to the audience themselves, versus, again, sort of the very first style that we have in the 20th century, where it's sort of like a TV box, where the audience is there, but they sort of are separated by that proscenium arch. This again sort of relied heavily on the use of sort of stage props, and having the actions sort of being able to play to sort of all four sides. Whenever we actually get to the stage directions, instead of having it the way that they are traditionally known as, in sort of the arena setting, directions were typically given in sort of a north, south, east, or west kind of stage direction. One of the other sort of fun things that sort of came about with the 20th century was sort of separation between some individuals who wanted to sort of move away from sort of the anti-realist movements, and they basically went around and they found spaces which provided a workable environment for this sort of divergent theater style. Uh, Such buildings basically included barns, churches, libraries, old movie theaters, and other sort of large, relatively open spaces. Some of the images here is one of Yale Repertory Theater, and this is basically a converted church. And then the other is the shack from, I will fill that in later. Moving on to stage directions. So this image is from the audience perspective, which basically means that if an individual is standing on stage and looking out into the audience, their left is designated as stage left, and their right is designated as stage right. Now, obviously, this is again where I would ask the simple question: why do you believe it is known as downstage and then also upstage? The reason for this is, again, sort of, if you can remember back, the use of sort of a raked stage. With a raked stage, obviously, if you were at the very bottom, you would be at the furthest or lowest point. But if you had to travel towards that back wall, you would physically have to climb up the raked stage, thus creating sort of the downstage or upstage notations. Here we have the theater hierarchy. Now, we don't go into depth regarding every position, but understanding the overall structure sort of helps realize the magnitude and the work that goes into sort of any kind of production. This really sort of depends on the company itself. From personal experience, when I worked down in Alabama for one production that we did, Little Mermaid, we had over about 100 staff members working behind the scenes to sort of create the costumes, sound, props, the set itself, and then the stagehands themselves. That did not include the 30 or so actors that we had for that performance as well. The producer or board of directors is kind of the same everywhere, and they're sort of the money that backs the project or the company itself. And they sort of are there to ensure that everyone sort of remains on track. The artistic and managing directors can be one individual, but the magnitude of the work oftentimes means that there are two individuals that sort of separates this world. The managing director is obviously in charge of sort of the overall money aspect to ensure that they have the proper funding and production budget for each show. The artistic director, on the other hand, is the one that's sort of in charge of the vision of the company or the vision of that particular season. They may have an overall vision which sort of helps tie the overall storytelling through what choices of plays that they may have picked. There is kind of some overlap there. The director then is typically the next person down in this line, and they are sort of underneath the artistic director, and the director is only in charge of a single production. So there may be 4 or 5 productions that go on in a particular season, but a director is only in charge of one of them. Typically what will happen is that a director will sort of meet with all of these designers and they will come up with sort of the concept for that particular production. And then from there, each sort of department sort of breaks down all of that information and starts creating everything. The production manager is often one that basically sort of ensures that everything sort of keeps on track for the overall schedule of any kind of given season. And they basically ensure that the master calendar, as it is known, is being followed as best as possible. And if any department may or may not fail or be behind, they can often either sometimes get more help or try to push that department to help crank everything out in time. While we could spend hours talking about each of those departments, we will obviously cover those throughout the course of the semester. Going now briefly to the production schedule. Every theater, as I mentioned before, is different in how they run things. This particular structure only sort of showcases one performance, which is kind of how we do it here at University of Pittsburgh. And what happens is you sort of have a good chunk of time that is designated for the overall design of that performance. As I mentioned briefly before, this is where the director sort of takes the meetings with all the departments and they discuss sort of what they want to have happen. And this is where the designers themselves will sort of start creating some sketches, drawings, templates, or anything, and they'll present it back to the director. And then once the director sort of finally agrees or likes something in particular, that is when everything sort of moves into that rehearsal or construction process. The rehearsal or build process sort of depends. The rehearsals are basically where the director takes all of the actors with them and they sort of start going or working through the script itself. The construction aspect sort of goes from typically or traditionally in this particular class, you as students would be the one building the set for that particular production. And then all of the other departments, costumes, sound, lighting, and props, again, sort of take all of their information or all of the things that they need and start producing as much of it as possible. Once you sort of have gone through that allotted time, you then get to what is known as sort of the technical or dress rehearsal time period. It is extremely shorter than a lot of the other sections just due to the fact that at this point a lot of things should have been worked out, and this is sort of the first time that you introduce all of the aspects of these departments into a single rehearsal. This is basically where all of the cues are finalized, such as the lighting cues, the sound cues, and a lot of the entrances and exits of actors and or scenery pieces to ensure that everything flows in a timely manner. Once that time period is up, you then get to the opening. This is basically where traditionally, again, once you have hit this sort of opening stage, the director sort of no longer is needed for that particular production. This is where it is in the hands of the stage manager, the run crew, and the actors themselves to ensure that the play runs towards or to the specifications that the director had chosen from the beginning. In a much larger sense, any kind of sort of playhouse or company may have multiple shows that sort of run almost simultaneously as another, sort of depending on how many spaces they have available for shows. As you can see in this image here, there is oftentimes a lot of overlap between either the design or construction phases of each of these performances. This is where it can get fairly tricky because there is oftentimes not enough individuals in any of these departments to sort of be able to build everything in a timely fashion. There have been, again, sort of personal experience, times in which we may have had a month or two to build one particular show simply because it was so elaborate, but we only were able to focus on that one show. Once it got to sort of the final stages, we then had to drop everything on it and then turn around, and we had maybe a week or 2 weeks to then put up an entire show from scratch. Moving on to the next slide, we have sort of lighting and sounds. Like I said before, we're just going to briefly skim the responsibilities of these departments, and we'll leave the bulk to be taught later in the semester. With lighting, the use of light and shadow, you can sort of create the atmosphere or illusion in which the audience can be immersed or meant to feel something. While the course mainly focuses on theater, I am going to sort of include some references to TV and movies, as it is pretty similar in all intents and purposes. Understanding sort of the evolution, obviously, then of stage lighting and electricity can be fairly important. We'll give a brief sort of history on lighting when we get that section. And this is sort of the first department where we sort of talk about script analysis, and that's basically just the breakdown of the script itself as far as determining the time of day that you may be at, if there's supposed to be a storm going on off stage or close by. And this just sort of helps create the overall mood and the setting for that particular play. Sound is, again, sort of understanding the physical nature of sound. If we recall back to the ancient Greeks, they were able to use sort of natural acoustics of a hillside to sort of help performers be able to sort of reach those massive auditoriums. So no one was able, since obviously they didn't have any microphones back then. That could be sort of a touchy subject for some individuals. Some people feel that microphones have made people less involved in sort of their craft because they feel that it's more of a crutch for actors, as they're not sort of producing as much as they should. But we won't cover that. Understanding sort of the 7 functions of sound. Obviously, you need to be able to hear everything. Motivation. This is sort of a little subtle thing. We'll cover more of it later. Music, obviously, sort of underscores or having something played in the background, having something time period associated is all sort of fairly important. Vocal alteration. This is one of the sort of effects side of sound, but it can sort of be created through in some natural forms. Vocal substitution, mood, and sort of extension of the dramatic space and time. Again, sort of go through a lot of those later. Costumes and props are not really my forte, but we will do our best to sort of go over them in the best way possible. One of the important things for the costume designers or costumes should do is, again, sort of help showcase the time period or the setting in which the play is being performed in. Obviously, if you have something that is supposed to be futuristic, you want something that is associated with something future-esque. This is where a lot of history and research comes into play. A lot of times, customers will sort of pull from traditional styles of that time period, but then put their own flair into each piece of costume, including sort of the fabric type that each character should be wearing, and then any kind of sort of different pieces that should sort of help sell what that person is all about. Props is one of the probably most underrated departments that you can sort of ever run into. Take for instance the last TV show you watched. Uh, every scene that is typically done in sort of like an interior setting, like any kind of crime novel where they go into someone's house for a murder scene. The props department for those particular shows have to sort of fill out that entire house to sort of create that environment that is important for that character. Uh, if props didn't exist, all of those shelves, all of those pieces of furniture, curtains, rugs, everything wouldn't exist. So obviously, if you try to imagine your favorite show that you've recently been watching and try to imagine none of that being there, it's kind of hard to believe that you can be immersed in that sort of scene because you sort of notice that there's nothing there. Moving on then to sort of the final stage, or the one that we will be focusing mainly on here, is carpentry. Uh, Now, most of the class does revolve around carpentry. Now, the online version, obviously, you're not going to get the hands-on experience, but we'll try to go into depth as best as possible that I can through video and PowerPoint presentations. If it ever comes down to it, I can do live performances with Power Tools, but obviously sound might be a serious issue there. One of the first things that we need to understand is to properly handle, maintain, and use the various tools. Obviously, I'm going to spend a good chunk of time ensuring that everyone understands what each tool does and what project or what it should be used for. Being able to sort of read plans and drawing. Obviously, in the online section, you'll have a lot more of these to sort of look at and go over as far as some of your quizzes may be involved. But it basically goes from the drawings that a designer creates, and they pass that information off to me, the technical director. I then have to interpret all of that information to sort of create my own drawings for all of the carpenters or students to then be able to read and then build from. Being able and verse in various materials and the effectiveness of how to use them. This class obviously is a lot more than just building with lumber or wood. There's a lot of other materials that do exist that do sort of help sell certain effects or create different things that you wouldn't normally associate with. So as we sort of go through these different styles, being able to understand what each one is normally used for and then what theater uses it for is kind of fun. Plumb, level, and square. It's a pretty basic thing that just about every carpenter should be quite familiar with. Plumb is basically a simple way of saying that something is perfectly vertical, up and down, forward and backwards. Obviously, if you're building a second level or a staircase or any kind of wall system, you want to ensure that everything is plumb. That way, whenever other pieces that are supposed to line up with it are also plumb and level to ensure that they go together well. Level, if you've ever seen pictures being hung on a wall, if something is out of level, you notice it. Ensuring that everything is level just basically sort of takes your mind off of it. You wouldn't notice it as much if everything was in the right orientation. But this also means that the internal framing of a lot of structures should be level or in line with where they're supposed to be built to ensure that the overall structure stays the way that it should and it doesn't collapse. Square is kind of exactly like it sounds. You just want to make sure that whenever you're building something that it maintains its actual shape. So obviously if you were to draw out a square, you would want to make sure that every single one of those four corners was a perfect 90 degrees. And this is true for a lot of structure or frames in theater. You want to make sure that all of those frames are exactly the correct angle to ensure it stays in that particular shape. One of the tools that we will be using quite a bit over the course, and this is again what I would normally ask, has anyone ever used a tape measure before? So there are different types of tape measures, and we'll cover those here shortly. But one of the simple ways of sort of reading a tape measure is sort of breaking it down into sort of this 1-inch measurements below. Now, most tape measures will have everything sort of reduced into 16ths of a fraction. And that basically just sort of means that if you were to sit there and count each one of those small ticks in between the first whole number, and the second whole number, there would be 15 of those little tick marks. So that's an easy way to sort of remember or sort of look for what specific measurement you're asking for. A lot of times there's a lot of drafting that sort of is created that is like 1'1" and 1/16. So a lot of times you got to remember where all of those fractions exist on a tape measure. But trying to remember that there are just 15 of those little ticks and you should be pretty good. Obviously, with fractions, you always want to reduce your fractions. So instead of it being 2/16, it would be 1/8, and so on for all of the others. There are some cases of some tape measures going all the way down to a 64th. That is not something you will typically see in theater, but it is possible. Some of the various types that we can come across is you may or may not have ever used what is known as a yardstick. Now, an actual yardstick is 1 yard long, which roughly converts to 3 feet or 3'3". And then you have a folding version, and the folding version just allows carpenters to be able to sort of have that capability while having it compact to where you can fold it up and stick it into your pockets. Ribbon tape, on the other hand, the at least smaller version that you see here, is typically used in costume shops or any kind of alterations. If you've ever had a suit or a dress tailor fit for you, you may have had that seamstress or individual use one of these sort of small ribbon tapes to get all of their measurements. It's basically just a really flimsy piece of material with all of their markings on them to quickly be able to sort of wrap around whatever they're trying to measure. This does come in some larger versions, such as this one that you see here, and they can be extremely useful in theater. One of the things that it can be typically used for is its ability to sort of quickly lay out a ground plan, which we'll cover again a little later, for the fact that you can have something that goes up to 100 feet, because some theater spaces can measure anywhere from 70 to 80 feet. or even more, depending on the overall scale of the theater space itself. Some of the more common types that we typically would be using in carpentry in general are what are known as steel retractable. These basically just have a small little ribbon that is wrapped around sort of that center in a sort of core style. And as you sort of pull that tape out, that metal becomes a little rigid and allows you to sort of quickly measure out and read whatever that tape measure is on. Obviously, it is not as large as sort of that 300 foot ribbon tape, but you'll typically see them anywhere from the adorable keychain version of 6 feet all the way up to typically about 40 feet, and that's when it gets a little cumbersome and a little bulky to be carrying around. The other version that you see here is what is known as a laser level. It is extremely accurate if you are working with them. You don't have to be well trained with them to understand how to operate them. You simply just sort of use the laser as sort of the measuring device, and it shoots out the laser, and when it hits whatever object you're trying to measure, it'll give you sort of that precise distance between those 2 points. Go to the last version that we have is what is known as sort of a scale ruler. This is more for sort of architects or reading draftings or ground plans. And it's basically sort of a 3-sided ruler. On each of the sides, it'll have sort of a different ratio or scale in which that is referring to. As you can see in the second picture there, if that line that it is measuring existed in that 1/2 inch scale, it would be measuring that specific distance. It is a great way for anyone to sort of quickly reassure that the scale is correct, or if there is a line that isn't given in dimensions, you can quickly grab your scale ruler to then double check the work that you have. Tolerance is basically defined as the amount of variation from a standard. It is important in almost all facts of life of carpentry, and the margin of error. Tolerance is basically defined as the allowable amount of variation from a standard. It is important just about in every case of carpentry. The margin of error varies from place to place. Tolerance is defined as the allowable amount of variation from a standard. It is important in just about every aspect of carpentry. The margin of error sort of varies from place to place, depending on sort of what type of standards that they're sort of trying for. Machine shops, which provide milled parts and pieces, can have as low as 1/64th of a tolerance, or even higher. Some will go all the way up to 1/128th or more. Obviously, those get into some very specifics, but some pieces need to be that accurate. While it could be possible to achieve some of these tolerances, it is a bit extreme to try to have them in standard theater carpentry. Professional theaters will typically have about a 0 up to about a 1/16th acceptable tolerance range, and this from experience is sort of just a way to sort of improve the overall quality of the carpenters and skill, and it's mainly because they want everything to fit quite perfectly. Community theater, on the other hand, is something that is rising in popularity just because, again, sort of like the found spaces There are a lot of sort of environments or buildings that are being converted into theater production companies. This will really vary depending on what skill level the carpenter is that they hire. Obviously, not every community theater can have a professionally trained carpenter. So they may have someone who does carpentry as a hobby, like a weekend hobby or something, which isn't to say that they are bad at their job, but it just means that their style or standards are different. There, you'll typically still have it anywhere between 0 and about a 1/4 inch, depending on sort of the overall budget and again the skill level of that carpenter. Which then sort of leads us to this educational environment. While it is an educational environment, I always do try to strive to ensure that all students sort of get as close and accurate to the final product as possible. But I typically accept anywhere from 0 to about an 1/8. So as I mentioned before, we're going to go briefly over sort of what draftings are. This image here is basically the layout for one particular performance that I have done over the past few years. And it basically shows the front, top, left, and right view of this one object. It is what the designer creates to sort of showcase all the detail that should be involved with a particular piece of scenery. Taking a closer look at that front view, obviously you can see that it is the staircase, but you start to see a lot more of the notes that are involved with this particular unit. One of the things that was really important for the designer to have is everything between those little slats needed to have a panel be removable. So that basically meant, as the technical director, I needed to design this particular unit in such a way to allow those panels to quickly sort of come on and off for a particular scene change. One of the other sort of big things that a technical director has to do is know where they're building and know where the show is being performed. For this particular performance, we had to build everything off-site and then move everything from the scene shop into the actual theater for the performance, which basically meant all of this had to be built in such a way that it could be easily put together and then also be able to travel well a great distance. So once I finished drafting everything in such a way, I would create a sort of simple drawing such as this here. This drawing here basically showcases what everything is that's involved with this particular unit. It basically gives you the measurements of all the pieces. So that would sort of showcase how long a board would have to be and how to sort of cut it, sort of what angles should be cut. It then also showcases sort of in the middle the overall spacing of where everything should lay out to sort of create that actual vision of that piece. Once everything is built and then put together, you get the final result. This was probably one of my more favorite pieces to do, especially sort of the handrail. And as you can sort of see those recessed panels, whenever we sort of got to the end of Act 1 during intermission, the stagehands would actually go through and take out some of those panels to sort of showcase sort of that empty hollow underneath the staircase, to sort of showcase some of the garbage that was there. All right. If you have any questions, feel free to start a discussion section, and I can answer it as I am aware of them. Or if you need, you can always contact me via email. All right. See you next class.